All right, so our notes for 8-4, we're looking at the American Revolution and how the Enlightenment was influential in this revolution, along with later on, we're going to look at how those Enlightenment ideas influenced our historical documents. So let's start off looking at what is going on in Europe at this time. And really, we're looking at this commercial revolution, this huge economic competition. Now, in France, under Louis XIV, his finance minister, Jean Baptiste Colbert, is going to present this economic theory known as mercantilism. And this idea is that you are to have a favorable balance of trade. And I would underline that favorable balance of trade, where you want to export more goods than you import. What Baptiste Colbert is telling Louis XIV is that you need to be a self sufficient nation. You want to be able to provide for your people. You don't want to fall like Spain did. Spain focused a lot on gold and silver, and they just said, well, we'll just buy things and bring it in to take care of our people. No, you need to be able to be reliant upon yourself. And so they start to embrace this economic theory, and they see that the more colonies that they have, the more powerful their nation is seen. And so we're competing with each other over trying to gain control over trade routes. Well, the Dutch were pretty much the leader during this commercial revolution. You know, they weren't dealing with a lot of the internal struggles that France and Great Britain were. Spain and Portugal were like the leaders in that race during the Renaissance, and the Dutch get involved. But now we're to the point where Spain and Portugal have they've kind of plateaued, and Spain has done a little nosedive with some of their decisions they've made, and the Dutch are number one. France and Great Britain are now getting involved in this race. They too want to be number one. And France and Great Britain have historically been enemies, but during this commercial revolution, for a short amount of time, they are going to pair up because they want to bring the Dutch down. And they do unite to defeat them. One way they're going to do so is the passage of certain laws in their land. And for Great Britain, they passed the Navigation Acts. And these were laws that prevented the colonists from selling valuable goods to other countries. Now, from the British perspective, they're seeing this as a way to hurt the Dutch and even the French because they're preventing their people from selling them any goods. Now, the British do buy goods from the colonists, but there is a set price. There is a fixed rate that they will pay. And as the colonists are selling their goods to other nations, then they can actually increase that profit, and they can start to build up their purse or their bank accounts. But now we've cut it off. That doesn't mean the colonists stop. That just means they're going to start smuggling their goods. Now, from the colonist perspective, they see this as an act against them because it's preventing them from that free market economy where they want to be able to sell their goods to whomever they please. But for the British, they need to bring down the Dutch, hurt the French, so they could be number one in this competition. Now, through the commercial revolution, there are quite a few wars, the commercial wars, but we're not going to go through all of those wars. There are just a few on the next slide that we're going to talk about. So we have the War of Austrian Succession between Austria and Prussia. And if you notice, Austria's teamed up with Great Britain and Prussia's teamed up with Russia. Now, this war started when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded the Austrian Empire and took Silesia for their own. This is a region in between their two countries that was very rich in resources and minerals. And Frederick the Great saw this as an opportunity to boost his nation, to help with the military, and to start moving toward that industrialization. Now, for France and Great Britain, this also becomes a war that they can get involved in on opposing sides because remember, they're competing with each other to be number one in this economic competition. For Austria, Maria Theresa wants her land back. And her father had thought back in 1713, when he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, that he was actually going to protect his daughter and their empire. But Frederick the Great could really care less about that Pragmatic Sanction and went in and took that land. Unfortunately for Austria, Prussia is going to win the War of Austrian Succession, and they're going to keep the land that they took. And then when we move to the 7 Years' War, it's round two. Austria and Prussia back at it again. And this time, Austria is trying to regain the land that they lost in the War of Austrian Succession. And if you look, France and Great Britain are again involved in this war. It's just this time they're on opposing sides. So now France has teamed up with Austria and Great Britain has teamed up with Prussia. And you'll also notice that Russia has joined the mix. So the 7 Years' War, we finally get to see Russia coming in and participating in the military and political actions within the continent. And through this 7 Years' War, we will see that Great Britain and France are actually going to venture out into other continents to also fight each other. So we have the conflict between France and Great Britain over who's going to control India. And we also have the conflict between France and Great Britain over who's going to control North America. Now, the war in India, who's going to have the economic control? And in the end, Great Britain wins that battle. And then in the French and Indian War, which is what's going to impact the colonists, Great Britain's going to win that too. Now, these wars cost money. And as I mentioned previously, there are more wars than what I have listed here during the commercial revolution. And as a costly endeavor to try to, expand your trading routes, expanding your territory, and being seen as a powerful nation, you're going to have to pay off these war debts. And for Great Britain, they figured that they could do that by taxing people. And as colonists, we didn't appreciate it. So when you look at why we're going to start declaring independence, well, we are upset. We didn't like the Navigation Acts because that was hindering who we could actually sell our goods to. That was regulation on trade. And now they're going to tax us. They're going to tax us with our paper for legal documents. They're going to tax the tea. They're going to pretty much control everything to collect money in order to pay off their war debts. And the fact that they got us involved, the colonists, in the French and Indian War to begin with, it was fought over here on the soil with the colonists. They had to make sacrifices in the war. They had to fight in the war. They lost family members in the war. And that England is now telling them, well, now you're going to have to pay off my debt for this war. The people are mad. And they're also mad because they aren't given an opportunity to actually participate in the decision making that's taking place. Now, when you look at England versus the colonists, you have to also take into consideration their perspectives. So from the British perspective and the British government's perspective, we are nothing but a colony here. And a colony is a territory that is governed internally by a foreign power. England is that foreign power that controls this territory. We, the people living here, work for England. Our purpose is to continuously help them gain political and economic status. That's our job, according to the views of the English government. We don't have rights. They protect us from other nations, and the way they see it, that French and Indian War protected the colonists from the French. And they did that by winning that war. But when you look at the American colonists' perspective, their side of things, they see themselves as British citizens who are working with the English government, not for them. And that as British citizens, they are protected under the English Bill of Rights. And that's that document that William and Mary, if you guys recall from our last unit, had agreed to in order for England to become a constitutional monarchy, where the king and queen would be limited by law and the people would be protected from an abusive government. So from the perspective of the colonists, it seems like our British government was becoming abusive. They were placing harsh taxes upon us. They were threatening us. They were not following the English Bill of Rights as far as we were concerned. And based on that document, we have the right to petition our king and to ask him to address our grievances. The reaction was that we were in the wrong, and if we continue to misbehave, then there would be public executions. We do it again. We continuously write down our grievances and we petition the king. Now, our delegates coming from the 13 colonies are meeting. What's happening in Boston is not happening down in Charleston, South Carolina. So, as you watch that video on John Adams, you're going to see that the representatives, they are at odds with each other. They don't agree with what's happening in other parts of the colonies, but it's not happening sometimes in theirs. And they have to address, how far can this government go before we collectively come together and take a stand, a unified stand. And that's going to be with that Declaration of Independence. So hopefully you're seeing in that video the struggle that the men go through. And when they finally make that decision, they're not going to cheer, they're not going to high five. You're going to see that it's like, oh my goodness, now the next step, now the next phase. Because as we have here, we are organizing for war. In some areas in our colonies, they're already battling. But eventually, it will have to be that collective unit. So when you look at your homework questions, excuse me, the first one asked you about the relationship between Parliament versus that colonial government. And within that relationship, as a colony, the British government does control them. And we're going to see many colonies throughout this year. When we get to our imperialism unit, we'll talk about indirect control and direct control. But what the British did in this situation is that they actually allowed the colonies to have their own legislature, which allowed them to act pretty much independent. And for a while, England's not having issues with that. They're doing a great job. But the colonists also see themselves as British citizens, as part of that empire, not working for them, but working with them. And we will discover that England's not going to make the same mistake twice with their other colonies. Allowing us to have that independence, it is going to backfire on the British. Your second question talked about what would be the causes and influences of this American Revolution. Well, following the 7 Years' War, Britain did try to raise taxes. They needed to pay off their war debts. The 7 Years' War had the leg in India, and it also had the leg here in North America with the French and Indian War. Tension and resistance from the colonists definitely escalated. They would tax, we would respond. We had the Boston Tea Party. We had little dolls of the king that we were burning in bonfires. They were tarring, feathering people. They were describing situations worse than what happened. And so you saw both sides taking negative actions in the situation. You also see that the Enlightenment. And when you look at our delegates and what they're going to share back and forth as they're discussing and debating whether or not we take a firmer stance against England and declare our independence and start our own independent country, you hear those Enlightenment ideas. So you see those ideas written in the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson. You hear them from Ben Franklin. You hear them from John Adams. That Enlightenment, we are now going to take these ideas that they were sharing throughout Europe and spreading throughout those salons in France, and we are going to put them into action. We need to justify why we are breaking away, and we're going to use the Enlightenment to do so, along with the English Bill of Rights. Because again, we see ourselves as British citizens that are protected under the law, and that the king is violating that law, and he is violating that social contract. Question 3 had asked you about the taxation without representation, and if the philosophers would think that it would be unfair. Yes, of course they would think it's unfair. Because when you look at the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers, They talked about people having a voice, being able to participate, being a part of the process. And we weren't part of the process. Those were orders that were coming from England telling us that they're going to place these taxes. We have the election coming up here in our own country in 2020. And when I leave school every day, there's a sign out here. I believe it's on Highland Croy that talks about a fire department tax, a levy. And your parents get to make that decision. They get to participate in that process, in that discussion. They get to vote whether or not they want that tax levy. Well, here in the 1700s, they weren't provided that opportunity. Yes, they had representation, but it wasn't someone of their choosing. It was someone that the British government chose to represent the colonies. And the way the colonists were seeing it, they weren't doing a very good job. They weren't interacting with the colonists and the delegates. They weren't talking to them. They weren't getting their point of view. They weren't representing what they were wanting with Parliament. So that completely eliminated the complete process for them. Now, one of your homework questions was to analyze this particular painting. And as you look through the painting, hopefully you're seeing, and hopefully you also saw when you watched John Adams, that this was not something that these men just woke up one day and said, yeah, we're just going to, break free. We just want to create our own independent country. They followed that logical procedure that was coming out of the Enlightenment. They looked at the pros and the cons. They debated the pros and the cons. They documented what are our grievances? What exactly has the British government done? Can we provide evidence to support that they violated our natural rights? Because we just can't say our natural rights were violated. We actually have to prove it. Provide that supporting evidence. That's what I tell you guys with your extended response questions. Provide me evidence to back up your claims. Some of you had pointed out in your answers, well, you can see there's papers, you see that, they seem to be approaching this in a serious matter, and they are. They took this seriously. So yes, you do see that logical approach. Yes, they are using reason to do so. So the break was made with careful thought and discussion among the people. Reflection of Enlightenment principles that we have natural rights. We're pulling from Locke's ideas, and we see that even in the Declaration of Independence. It pulls all of John Locke's ideas from his 2 treatises on government. Now, I included this in because I thought it was a great painting, because you have Trumball's painting at the top, and below you have the descendants of our founding fathers, the men who had come together. And it definitely encompasses what this nation has become today. We've used this picture for, a couple of years, especially after they had shared the one on the bottom, but we thought, look, it's really cool to see where we started from and then where we are today from their lineage, their family lines. Question 5 had asked you about John Locke's social contract and how that contract's being used, because it suggests that citizens have a right to overthrow an unjust government, one that does not protect their natural rights, and you need to create a new one. So when we wrote the Declaration of Independence, we point out the unjust government. We point out the flaws, what's being done to us. And we are using John Locke's social contract as the reason why we can break away. And actually, not why we can, but why we should. And that it failed to protect our natural rights, that British government did. It violated that contract. And when you violate the contract, then we need to create a different one somewhere else. And we need to create a new government. So our colonial leaders will use the Enlightenment ideas to justify breaking away from England. And then we have our Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. It's going to be a long and bloody revolution, but in the end, they will be successful. So what you guys need to do is make sure that you have, oops,